Nia Okafor thought the worst day of her life was the day her father died. She was wrong. The worst day is today, standing in a crumbling chapel in a dress that doesn't fit, about to be handed to a homeless stranger for less money than a used television. Her stepmother is smiling. That smile should have been the warning, because the man waiting at the altar with dirt on his jacket and silence behind his eyes is not what he appears to be, not even close. And by tonight, Nia's entire world will be unrecognizable. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The dress was ivory, or it had been once. Now it carried the particular gray of something stored too long in the wrong place. A closet that smelled of mothballs and old decisions, pulled out this morning by hands that did not ask permission. Nia Okafor stood in the narrow bathroom off the kitchen and stared at herself in the water-spotted mirror and tried to find something in her own face that resembled calm. She did not find it. The bodice pinched at her ribs. The zipper in the back had been forced closed, and she could feel the teeth biting into her spine when she breathed too deeply, so she had stopped breathing deeply. She had stopped a lot of things in this house. Stopped asking questions, stopped expecting answers, stopped counting the years. She was 20 years old, and she felt like a woman who had already lived 2 lifetimes and been handed the bill for both. From somewhere beyond the bathroom door, she could hear Celine's voice carrying down the hallway. That low, carrying tone her stepmother used when she wanted to sound gracious without the effort of actually being so. Celine Brooks was on the phone. Something about arrangements. Something about timing. The word ceremony drifted through the gap beneath the door, and Nia pressed her palms flat against the edge of the sink and stared at the drain. Her father had been dead for 3 years. Edward Okafor had died in this house, in the bedroom 2 floors above where Nia currently stood, and in the weeks following the funeral, while Nia was still learning how to sleep through the night again, Celine had moved with the efficiency of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this moment. Lawyers arrived. Documents were signed. The estate, the accounts, the legacy of a man who had built his modest fortune through 20 years of disciplined work. All of it transferred into the careful grip of a woman who had spent 4 of those years pretending to love him. Nia had been 17. She had no legal standing. She had no money of her own. She had a bedroom in the East Wing that had once been used for storage. And she had the list of daily tasks Celine left on the kitchen counter each morning, written in the same sharp handwriting that had once signed her father's death certificate as witnessed. She had stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because the house was the last place on earth that still smelled faintly like her father, like cedar and old paper and the particular warmth of a man who had believed in the ordinary goodness of an ordinary life. She had stayed because leaving felt like the final surrender, and Nia Okafor had always believed, somewhere in the bruised and stubborn center of herself, that something would change. Something had changed. She pulled her hands back from the sink. They left wet prints on the porcelain. 3 days ago, Celine had walked into the kitchen while Nia was mopping the floor, not asked her to stop, not waited for a natural pause, simply planted herself in the center of the room and announced it the way someone announces the weather. There was a man. He needed a wife. The arrangement had already been made. Nia had not moved. The mop had stayed in her hands. She remembered the particular quality of her own silence in that moment, not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of a person whose mind has stopped processing because what it just received does not fit into any known category. "What arrangement?" she had said finally. Celine had looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for conversations she considered beneath her. A slight compression of the lips, a fraction of a brow raise. "Don't make this dramatic. It's a practical solution. He needs a wife for legal purposes. You need a situation. $200 changes hands and everyone moves forward. $200? You heard me." Nia had looked down at the mop in her hands, at the floor she'd been cleaning, at the reflection in the freshly mopped tiles of a woman in a kitchen that had once been her mother's kitchen, in a house that had once been her father's house, scrubbing the floors of a life she had never chosen. "No," she had said. It hadn't mattered. She had learned early that in Celine's version of this house, no was a position that could be overcome with the right combination of documentation and social pressure. By the following morning, Celine had produced a document. Nia still didn't fully understand its legal architecture, that connected her continued residency in the house to her cooperation. The alternative was the street. The alternative was nothing, with no coat and less than $40 saved in the lining of a bag under her bed. So here she was, in an ivory dress that wasn't hers, in a bathroom that smelled of cheap floral cleaner. 3 hours away from a ceremony she had not agreed to, marrying a man she had never met. Celine knocked on the door twice, sharp and businesslike. "Car's here in 15 minutes." Nia did not respond. She looked at herself one more time. The dress, the crease between her brows that had been there so long it had started to feel like a feature. The eyes that were her father's eyes, and held, even now, something that had not entirely broken. And then she turned off the bathroom light and opened the door. The chapel was a 40-minute drive from the house, deep into a part of the city where the buildings got lower and the streets got quieter, and the pavement had cracks that the city had long since stopped pretending it would fix. It was not a religious institution. It was not particularly anything. A room with pale walls, folding chairs, a wooden platform at the front, and a man behind a small lectern who had the look of someone who performed these brief legal ceremonies several times a week and had stopped asking questions about context. Celine sat in the first row. She had brought her assistant, a thin woman named Clara, who always smelled of coffee and spent most of her time entering things into her phone. 2 of the chairs on the groom's side were occupied by men Nia did not recognize, one in a dark jacket, one in a gray coat, both sitting with a stillness that felt deliberate. Not the stillness of boredom, the stillness of people trained to wait without showing that they were waiting. Nia noticed this. She filed it somewhere and kept walking. The man at the altar was not what she had expected, though she had worked hard to expect nothing. He was Korean, tall for the angle she'd been given to judge at, with a build that his ill-fitting clothes partially concealed. The jacket was wrong for his shoulders, too narrow across the back, like it belonged to someone slightly smaller. His face was unshaven, not in the fashionable way, but in the way of a man who had been somewhere without access to the things most people take for granted. His hair was clean but unstyled. His hands, when she caught a glimpse of them, were large and still at his sides. He turned when she entered. His eyes were dark, not cold. She had expected cold, but something harder to categorize, something that felt, with a precision that unsettled her, like evaluation. Not cruel evaluation, the kind a person does when they are trying to understand something they haven't made up their mind about. She walked to the platform. She did not take his arm. Nobody had told her to, and she wasn't going to perform warmth she didn't have. The man with the lectern began the abbreviated civil ceremony. The words washed past her. She heard her own name when it was time to respond, and she responded because the alternative was a scene, and Nia had learned long ago that scenes in this house, in any house Celine occupied, never resolved in her favor. "Do you, Kang Tae-jin, take this woman?" She heard him say yes. His voice was low. He had an accent, not heavy, not performative, but present. She did not look at him. "Do you, Nia Okafor, take this man?" She said yes. The word tasted like nothing, like paper. The man with the lectern closed his folder. Celine stood and smoothed her jacket and exchanged a brief nod with the man in the gray coat, a motion so quick it could have been imagined. Clara tapped something into her phone. The $200, presumably, had already changed hands somewhere upstream of this moment, in whatever transaction Celine had arranged with whatever person she had arranged it with. Nia stood on the wooden platform and held a piece of paper, the marriage certificate, which had been placed in her hands without ceremony, and stared at her own signature in ink that had not yet dried. She was married. She had been in the room for 11 minutes. Tae-jin turned to her, not to smile. She registered the absence of a smile, and did not find it as alarming as she might have expected. The performed smiles of today would have been worse. "There's a car outside," he said, "if you'll come with me." It was not phrased as a command. It was phrased as something that acknowledged she had the choice, even in this hallway, even now. The specificity of that surprised her enough that she followed him. The car outside was not what she expected. It was black. That was the ordinary part. The make was not ordinary. She didn't know cars well enough to name it precisely, but she knew the difference between a vehicle that existed for transportation and a vehicle that existed to demonstrate something. And this car was the latter. It was long. The windows were dark. 2 men stood at attention beside it, with the posture of people who had been trained to stand that way and had done so for long enough that it had become unconscious. Tae-jin opened the door himself and held it. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the car and looked at him. "Who are you?" she said. It came out flat. not a performance of confrontation, a real question. "Get in," he said. "I'll explain in the car." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, and something crossed his face. Not irritation, not the reflexive condescension of a man who expects compliance. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like the particular tiredness of a person who has been carrying a truth for a long time and is approaching the moment of setting it down. "It isn't. But the explanation is better suited to somewhere we're not standing on a public sidewalk." She got in the car. She didn't know why. She told herself it was because she had no alternate plan, which was true. She told herself it was because Celine's car was already gone, which was also true, but there was something else. Something in the way he'd phrased it. The explanation is better suited. Not, "I'll explain later." Not, "Trust me." The particular wording of a person accustomed to managing information with precision. That precision frightened her more than the car did. The interior smelled of leather and something faintly chemical, clean in a way that suggested recent professional maintenance. She sat against the far door and watched him. He sat across from her. The configuration was facing seats, not side by side, and the car moved without her feeling an acceleration, which meant the driver was very good or the vehicle was very engineered. "I owe you the truth," he said. "You owe me more than that." A pause. "Yes," he said. "I do." He told her. Not everything. She would understand later that the version she received in the car was an edited version, trimmed of detail, structured to be receivable rather than complete. But enough. Enough for the next hour to make sense. Enough for the direction the car was traveling to make sense. The Baiko Syndicate. She had heard the name distantly, the kind of name that surfaces in headlines and then recedes because the full story is too large and too frightening to hold in civilian memory for long. A Korean organized crime organization with operations in 7 countries and financial interests on 3 continents. The name meant White Tiger in Korean. It was not an organization that was discussed openly. It was not an organization whose leadership was publicly known. Tae-jin was the head. She did not say anything for a long time after he finished. The city was changing outside the window. The low buildings and cracked streets were gone. The neighborhoods were getting different. The kind of different that announces itself in the width of the lots and the setback of the houses and the absence of the particular low-level urban noise that had been the background score of Nia's entire life. Then the neighborhoods were gone entirely, and they were on a road that did not look like a public road. The surface was too perfect, the margins too precise, the tree line on either side too deliberately placed. How much of this did she know? Nia said. Celine. He considered the question. Enough to understand who she was contacting when she made the arrangement. And she sold me to you anyway. For $200, he said, and his tone had something in it she couldn't name. Not mockery, not disgust, but something colder and more considered than either. Yes. Nia looked out the window. Her hands were in her lap, and she pressed them together, not because she was cold, but because she needed to do something with them. The marriage certificate was in her bag. She had not let go of the bag. The gates, when they came, were not subtle. They were tall and black and set into a stone wall that disappeared into tree line on either side, and they were flanked by 2 guard stations, each occupied by 2 men who wore the kind of deliberate neutrality that only people with weapons can fully sustain. The car slowed. Something was checked. The gates opened. The estate beyond them was large in the way that money in excess of any functional need tends to express itself. Not a mansion in the cinematic sense, though the main house was substantial, but an entire world contained within a perimeter. There were outbuildings. There were vehicles in a configuration that suggested regular use. There were people, visible people, moving between structures with the purposefulness of a place that has its own internal logic. Nia looked at all of it and said nothing. The car stopped at the main house. Tae-jin got out and held the door again. She stepped onto gravel, real gravel, the raked kind, and stood with the marriage certificate in her bag and the too-tight dress biting her spine and looked at the building in front of her. You were living near the train tracks, she said. Yes. For how long? 4 months. She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was flat and even, and it removed the shelter of shadows, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. The exhaustion that had settled in around his eyes, the particular quality of a man who had been existing on the margins of something by choice, the way his jaw held attention even when his expression was composed. Why? She said. Because I needed to know, he said, if there was anything left in me that a person could value. That wasn't the boss. That wasn't the fear. She looked at him for a long moment. The gravel was even and cool under the thin soles of the dress shoes Celine had put her in. A bird moved in the trees somewhere behind the garden wall. And? She said. He didn't answer. He gestured toward the door. She went inside. The interior of the house did not perform its wealth. That was the first thing she registered. The absence of ostentation, the way the rooms felt occupied rather than displayed. There were books on actual shelves, arranged in the way of someone who reads rather than someone who decorates. There was a kitchen that smelled of recent use. There were shoes near one of the interior doors, left there without ceremony, the way a person leaves shoes in a house that is actually their home. A woman appeared in the hallway, middle-aged, Korean, with the focused efficiency of someone who manages a complex household without needing to announce the effort. She bowed slightly to Tae-jin and then looked at Nia with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who has learned to receive new information without broadcasting her reaction to it. Mrs. Park, Tae-jin said, this is Nia. She'll be staying in the East Suite. Please. He paused, and something shifted in his tone just slightly. Make sure she has everything she needs. Mrs. Park nodded and looked at Nia with that same controlled neutrality, and then at the very end of the look, something that might have been a small measure of sympathy. This way, she said. Nia followed her up the stairs. The East Suite was 3 rooms, a bedroom, a sitting room, a bathroom, with fixtures that cost more than Nia had earned in the past 2 years combined. The bed was made with the precision of someone who understood that the quality of a made bed communicates something. There were towels folded on the bathroom rack. There were toiletries on the shelf, still in packaging. Mrs. Park showed her how the thermostat worked, where the extra blankets were kept, which window latch needed a second press to fully catch. She did all of this without editorializing, without the particular weight of commentary that Celine's household staff had always loaded into their most ordinary interactions. Is there anything specific you need before dinner? Mrs. Park asked. Nia sat on the edge of the bed. The dress was still on. The zipper was still biting her spine. I need scissors, she said, or something to cut this. Mrs. Park left and returned 3 minutes later with a small sewing kit and a pair of fabric scissors. She set them on the dresser without comment and closed the door behind her. Nia sat with the scissors in her hand and looked at the room. This was real. The room was real. The estate was real. The man downstairs, the man who was apparently her husband, was the head of a criminal organization that moved money and influence through 7 countries. She was sitting on a bed in his house. She had signed a marriage certificate. She had $40 in the lining of a bag she hadn't let go of. She stood and reached back and cut the zipper of the dress in a straight line from neck to base and stepped out of it onto the floor. Then she sat back down on the edge of the bed in her slip and looked at the wall until the light changed. He knocked on the door at 7. Not entered. Knocked. Dinner's been prepared, he said through the door. I'm not hungry. A pause. Okay. She heard him walk away. She listened to the sound of his footsteps until she couldn't hear them anymore, then lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize the day into something that made structural sense. It did not cooperate. She slept without meaning to, which her body apparently needed more than her mind could object to. In the morning, she came downstairs and found the kitchen, and found coffee already made, and found him sitting at the table with a document in front of him, and a pen in his hand, and the phone screen down beside his cup. He looked up when she came in. There are eggs, he said. Mrs. Park keeps them on the second shelf. She found the eggs. She found a pan. She cooked without asking him anything because she needed the ordinary mechanics of it. The heat of the stove, the sound of the pan, the particular focus of cracking an egg without getting shell, to put herself back in her own body. She ate at the counter because the table felt too much like a decision. He let her. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the first days. He let her. Not in the way of a man performing patience to demonstrate character. She had seen enough of that kind of performance to recognize the shape of it. This was something different. He moved through the house without crowding her. He did not interrogate her. He did not offer explanations she hadn't asked for. When she came into a room, he did not perform welcome. When she left, he did not perform indifference. He was simply there, present and not pressing. And that specific combination, present without pressing, was something she had no prior experience with. On the 4th day, she asked him about the money. She did it in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her coffee cup, and she asked it directly. "Where is the $200?" she said. "The money she got. Did it go to you? Did it come from you? I need to understand the transaction." He set his cup down. "The contact Celine reached out to is a man named Dong Su. He works for me. The arrangement was presented to him as a woman in a difficult situation who needed a husband for stability and didn't have other options. He told me about it. And you agreed. I had been watching several of these arrangements. Women in positions where someone with authority over them was selling access to their lives. I wanted to understand the pattern." He paused. "Celine thought she was selling you to someone desperate enough to pay for a wife. She didn't know who she was actually dealing with." Nia looked at him for a long time. "So it was, what, research?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "Not for a long time. I saw your file. I read what she'd done to you. I made a decision. To rescue me," she said, and her voice was flat. "To offer you a way out. Whether you wanted it was supposed to be your choice. It wasn't my choice. I had no choice." "I know," he said. And again there was no performance in it. No attempt to reframe the harm, no pivot toward his own good intentions. Just two words that acknowledged a fact and didn't run from it. She looked at her coffee. "Don't pretend you did something noble," she said. "I'm not. Because I'm still here without having agreed to be. Just in a bigger cage." The silence that followed was not comfortable. She hadn't aimed for comfortable. He sat with it without deflecting, and that too was something she had no model for. "You can leave," he said, "if that's what you want. I can make arrangements, money, housing, documentation that protects you from whatever Celine has on paper. You don't have to stay." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because your being here because you have to is worth nothing," he said, "to either of us." She didn't leave. She didn't agree to stay, not in any formal way. She existed in the house, and he existed in the house, and the days accumulated without either of them naming what the accumulation was. She discovered the garden on the 6th day, a walled space behind the east wing, ordered and tended, with a bench in the far corner under a tree whose species she didn't know. She began going there in the mornings. He never followed her there, and she came to understand that this was deliberate. She began to move through the house more freely. She began to eat at the table. She began to notice things. The books on his shelves were annotated, margins filled with handwriting in 2 languages. There were photographs on the desk in his study, which she passed without entering, and in the photographs was a younger version of him and an older man whose face held the particular gravity of someone who has seen a great deal and kept most of it. She asked Mrs. Park one evening who the older man was. Mrs. Park's expression did something careful. "Mr. Kang's grandfather," she said. "They are... estranged is the word, I think. They haven't spoken in some time." "Why?" Mrs. Park considered. "I think," she said, choosing each word, "that some of the things Mr. Kang is trying to leave behind, his grandfather helped build them." Nia thought about that for a long time. On the 9th day, she came downstairs in the middle of the night because she couldn't sleep. The house had sounds she wasn't accustomed to, the particular settling of a large structure, and she was still calibrating. And she found him in the kitchen, sitting with the lights low, not eating, not reading, just sitting. The posture of a man thinking something that has weight. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "No." "There's tea. 2nd cabinet, right side." She made tea. She sat at the table across from him. Not because she had decided to be warm, but because standing in the doorway felt like more of a decision. "What do you do?" she said. "When you're not here?" He looked at her. "I run things." "The organization?" "Yes." "What does that actually mean, day to day?" He thought about it. "It means making decisions that other people have enough incentive to carry out. Financial decisions, operational decisions, personnel decisions." A pause. "And occasionally decisions about what to do when someone tries to take something that belongs to us. Violence. Sometimes." "Does that bother you?" He looked at her steadily. "It used to keep me up at night. Now it just keeps me up." She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Is that why you left? The 4 months?" "Partly." "What was the other part?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was 43 years old," he said, "and I realized I had never had a conversation with anyone who wasn't either afraid of me or trying to get something from me. I wanted to know if that was the world or if it was me. She looked at him across the kitchen table, the low light, the tea, the large quiet house around them, and she felt the specific weight of what he had just admitted. Not its romance, if there was any, its cost, what it meant for a man to have arrived at 43 and not know the answer to that question. "And?" she said. He looked at her. "The jury's still out." She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully formed and looked back at her teacup, but she felt him notice it, and she didn't think the noticing was unkind. She went back to bed. She slept better that night than she had since her father died. The following week she found the boxes in the storage room off the east wing, heavy, labeled in her father's handwriting. She hadn't expected them. She stood in the storage room doorway for a long time, and then she went and found Tae-jin and asked him, without context, "Did you have someone bring boxes from the house?" He looked up from his desk. "Your father's study materials. Celine had them set out for disposal. My contact recovered them before the pickup." She stood in his office doorway. Her throat was doing something she needed to control. "Why?" "Because they were yours," he said, simply, without performance. She went back to the storage room and she opened the first box and she found her father's handwriting on notebooks and folders and envelopes, and she sat down on the floor among them and wept with a violence and privacy that she had been holding in reserve for 3 years. She wept until there was nothing left to expel. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and began reading. She was still there at 3 in the morning when Tae-jin appeared in the doorway with a blanket. He didn't come in. He set it on the floor just inside the threshold, looked at her for a moment with that same unreadable evaluation she had started to understand was not indifference, and left. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and kept reading. He was not a good man. She had made no decision about that. He was a man who had done things that existed outside of her framework for forgiveness or condemnation, and she had not yet decided what to do with the proximity of those things. But he was also a man who had sent someone to rescue her father's notebooks from a garbage pile. And she was sitting in a room with those notebooks at 3 in the morning with a blanket around her shoulders, and the specific mathematics of that, what it meant about him, what it said about her, what it was building in the space between them, was something she was not yet ready to name. She did not have to name it yet. What she knew was this. Outside these walls, somewhere in the city, Celine Brooks was sleeping without guilt in a house she had stolen. And somewhere in the international structure of an organization whose full shape Nia had only begun to understand, there were people. She did not yet know who, could not yet know who were watching the new wife of the Baeko boss and calculating what she was worth and what her existence meant for the balance of power that Tae-jin's 4-month disappearance had disrupted. She did not know about Han Seo-rin yet. She did not know that name. She did not know the history it carried, the engagement it represented, the dynasty it connected, the fury that was building in a woman who had spent her entire life preparing to stand beside the most powerful Korean crime boss on the continent, only to be displaced by a stranger bought for pocket change. She did not know about Jungmin Seok. She did not know that somewhere in the fractures of the organization, in the resentments that had accumulated while Tae-jin walked anonymous along train tracks, a man was doing math of his own, calculating grudges, testing alliances, building something with the slow patience of someone who has decided that patience is the one weapon left to him. She sat in the storage room with her father's notebooks and her blanket and the low hum of a house that held its secrets in its walls, and she did not know any of it yet. But morning was coming, and with it, everything that morning carries, the light that makes things visible that the dark had hidden, the knock on the door that changes the shape of the day, the name, spoken in a tone that carries its own warning, that you have never heard before and will never be able to unhear. Morning was coming, and someone was already in the car. She heard the car before she saw it. She was in the garden, the walled space behind the east wing that had become the one part of the estate she had claimed without asking permission, when the sound of tires on the front gravel carried over the wall. It was a different sound than the vehicles she had grown accustomed to in 2 weeks. The estate had its rhythms, its regular arrivals and departures, and she had learned them the way you learn the sounds of a house at night. This was not one of them. This was faster, more deliberate. The kind of arrival that does not slow down enough to be polite. She stayed in the garden. Whatever it wasn't hers yet. But 20 minutes later, Mrs. Park appeared in the garden doorway with an expression that was controlled in the specific way of a woman suppressing something she would not be paid enough to say out loud. "Mr. Kang asks if you would come inside," she said. "Asks?" Nia said. Yes, that word, asks, was different from the other words Mrs. Park had used in the past 2 weeks to convey Tae-jin's preferences. Nia set down the notebook she'd brought outside and followed her in. She heard the voice before she reached the main room. A woman's voice. Korean, rapid, carrying the particular pitch of someone who is accustomed to a room arranging itself around her presence and is currently discovering that this room has not gotten the instruction. Nia stopped in the hallway just outside the entrance to the main sitting room and listened for 3 seconds before she went in, because 3 seconds was enough. The woman standing in the center of the room was beautiful in the way that requires maintenance and investment and the particular confidence of someone who has never had to perform beauty without resources. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of posture that is trained rather than natural, and she was dressed in a way that communicated money not through extravagance, but through precision. Every choice exact, every detail considered. She was looking at Tae-jin. He was standing near the window with his arms at his sides and his face in the particular stillness Nia had come to recognize as his mode under pressure. Not blank, contained. The woman's eyes moved to Nia when she entered. Something happened in her face. A compression, fast and controlled, that lasted less than a second and left nothing visible behind it. But Nia had spent years reading the faces of people who were performing calm over contempt, and she had read it. "Nia," Tae-jin said. "This is Han Seo-rin." The name meant nothing to Nia yet. She watched his face when he said it and saw in the set of his jaw that it was supposed to mean something, that the name carried weight he had not yet transferred to her. "Han Seo-rin," Nia said. Flat, waiting. Seo-rin looked at her the way a person looks at something that has been placed in the wrong room. Not angry yet. Still in the phase of evaluation that precedes anger. "You must be the wife," Seo-rin said. Her English was precise, slightly formal, carrying the quality of someone who learned it from tutors rather than from living. "I've heard a great deal about the arrangement." "I don't know anything about you," Nia said. "So we're not starting even." Something flickered in Seo-rin's eyes. She turned to Tae-jin. "You didn't tell her." "There was no reason to." "No reason." Seo-rin said it softly, which was somehow more alarming than volume would have been. "Tae-jin, we had an agreement. Our families had an agreement. 15 years of negotiation and positioning, and you disappeared for 4 months and came back with—" She stopped. Redirected. "Our engagement was announced to both organizations. There are financial structures built around that assumption. There are alliances predicated on it. The engagement was never my agreement," he said. "It was arranged without my consent when I was 26. I told your father that 3 years ago. And yet you never formally ended it." "I'm ending it now." The room was very quiet. Nia stood near the doorway and felt the specific quality of a silence that has been building for a long time and has finally been given a room large enough to expand into. She understood now what she was standing in the middle of. Not a conversation. The final scene of a much longer negotiation. "Who is she?" Seo-rin said. The question was addressed to Tae-jin, but her eyes were on Nia. "My wife," he said before that. "That's the only answer I have for you." Seo-rin looked at Nia for a long moment. "Where did you come from?" she said. Not cruelly, with the tone of a woman attempting to solve a problem by locating its origin point. "Does it matter?" Nia said. "It will," Seo-rin said. And there was something in those 2 words, not a threat, or not only a threat, but a statement of sequence. "And I know something about how this ends that you do not." She said it the way a person states a fact about weather, impersonally, with the patience of someone who has decided to let the future do the work. She left 20 minutes later. She did not storm out. She gathered herself and said a brief, correct goodbye and walked out with the posture of someone who has not lost anything yet because she has decided the real contest has not yet begun. Tae-jin stood at the window and watched the car leave. "Tell me," Nia said. He turned. "Everything you left out," she said. "Tell me now. Because if I find out there's more later, the way I found out today, I'm going to stop being able to trust the edges of what you tell me. And I need the edges." He sat down. This too, she noted. He sat down, which meant this was going to take time, which meant there was more. There was more. The engagement to Seo-rin had been formally proposed by her father, Han Jae-won, when Tae-jin was 26, and the Baeko Syndicate was in a period of external pressure from a rival organization operating out of the Pacific Northwest. The Han family controlled distribution networks along the West Coast. The alliance would have solved a logistical and territorial problem with a single arrangement. Taejin had not been consulted in any meaningful way. He had been informed. He had lived with it for years. Not accepted it. Lived with it the way you live with something load-bearing that you know is structurally wrong, but cannot remove without bringing down the surrounding walls. And then you left, Nia said. And then I left. And the engagement was just suspended. I wasn't available to formalize anything. My grandfather's council handled organizational matters during my absence. They would have told Jaewon I was temporarily unreachable. They would not have told him why. And Seorin, he was quiet for a moment. Seorin has been preparing for this her entire life. Her father raised her to be the wife of the Baeko head. That was not, I need you to understand this clearly. That was not a choice she made. It was built into her. The expectation, the preparation, the identity. Is that supposed to make me sympathetic to her? No, it's supposed to give you an accurate picture. Nia sat with that. She's going to cause problems, she said. Yes. For me specifically. He looked at her steadily. For both of us. But yes. She stood. She needed to move, needed to put her body in motion, because the information was working its way through her and she could feel the specific heat of it, not fear exactly. The complex temperature of understanding that the situation she had walked into was larger and more occupied than she had been shown. She walked to the window he had been standing at and looked out at the drive where the car had been. What does she have? Nia said. What do you mean? Resources, leverage. What does she have to use against you? He paused. Her family still controls the West Coast networks. Breaking the engagement formally gives them justification to realign with our competitors. That's financial damage and territorial exposure. She knows this. And against me specifically. She doesn't need anything specific. You're the pressure point. If she can make your position here, your legitimacy as my wife, look unstable or fraudulent, she weakens me indirectly. Nia turned from the window. How many people in your organization know about the arrangement? The $200. Celine. He met her eyes. He understood the question's architecture. Dong-soo, two others who handled the initial contact. And if Seorin finds out, she'll find out, he said. That's not a question of if. And when she does, she'll use it. Nia looked at him. Then we need to have a conversation about what we actually are, she said. Because right now, I don't know if I'm a wife or a liability or a piece in something I still don't understand all the rules of. He stood. You're not a piece. Then tell me what I am. The silence between them was different from the silences of the previous 2 weeks. Those had been the silences of two people learning the distance between them. This was the silence of the distance shrinking against both their intentions. In a room where a woman had just stood and looked at Nia with eyes that said, "This will cost you," and neither of them had flinched. I don't know yet, he said, but it's not that. It was not the answer she wanted. It was the honest answer, which she had told him she required, and she stood in the honest answer's discomfort and said nothing more. That night she heard him on the phone after midnight. She was in the hallway, heading to the kitchen, the insomnia returning, and his study door was slightly open and the voice that came through it was different from his daytime voice. Still low, but with a compression in it, a density that she had not heard before. Korean, rapid, and in a register that told her this was not a business call in the way the organization's business usually manifested in her peripheral awareness. This was a confrontation being managed from a distance. She did not stop. She went to the kitchen and made tea and sat with it and listened to the house. When she heard the study door open, she did not pretend she had not been awake. He came to the kitchen and saw her at the table and stopped in the doorway. Seorin, she said. Not a question. Her father, he said. Jaewon. He's not pleased. What does not pleased look like from him? Taejin came to the table and sat. He looked tired in a way that went below the surface, the kind of tired that is not resolved by sleep, but by resolving things. It looks like a phone call at midnight with a list of financial consequences delivered in the tone of a man who considers them inevitable. Is he right? He's not wrong. He put his hands flat on the table. He's going to pull the West Coast arrangement. I have 2 weeks before the formal withdrawal. After that, we have exposure on 3 distribution channels and a competitor who has been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Nia looked at his hands on the table. Steady. She thought about the phone call, the midnight tone. And Seo Rin isn't just following her father, Nia said. He looked at her. No. She has her own plans. Seo Rin is more intelligent than her father. She's more patient. She works from outcome backward, not from emotion forward. He paused. She was raised to want this, not the man. I want to be clear about that. She doesn't. What she wants is the position, the power that comes with it. The alliance was designed to give her family a level of influence inside Beiko that they would not otherwise have. I was the mechanism. And I'm the problem that broke the mechanism. You're the evidence that I chose differently. Naya held her teacup. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the garden wall, something moved in the trees. A branch, wind, the ordinary sounds of a world continuing regardless. She thought about Celine's face the morning she had announced the arrangement, that particular smile. She thought about signing the marriage certificate in 11 minutes in a room she'd never been in before. She's going to come after me directly, Nia said. Not through you. She's going to try to... She paused, working it out, the architecture of it. She's going to try to make me leave on my own, or look like I don't belong here, or uncover the money. Yes, he said. Probably all three. Then I need to know more about the organization, about how it works, about what the people inside it think about me. He was quiet for a moment. Why? Because I'm not going to be handled, she said. I've been handled my whole life. I am not going to sit in this house and be a pressure point that people use against you without understanding what they're doing or how to... She stopped. Started again. I need to understand my own situation. He looked at her for a long time. Most people in your position would ask for the exit, he said. The money, the housing, the arrangement I offered you. Is that what you want me to do? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. No. Then stop being surprised when I don't. He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted. Not the contained stillness of pressure, but something beneath it, something that had less armor on it. He picked up his coffee cup, which had gone cold, and looked at it. All right, he said. He began telling her. Not everything. She understood there were operational specifics that existed outside of what she needed to know and outside of what would be safe for her to carry. But the structure of it, the internal hierarchy, the men who had been loyal to him for a long time, and the men whose loyalty was attached to outcomes rather than to him specifically. The history of the Beiko Syndicate's expansion and the specific frictions it had created, the names that mattered, the alliances that were real, and the ones that were maintained only by the mutual recognition of consequences. She listened. She asked questions when she had them, and they were good questions. He noticed this, she could tell he noticed, in the slight recalibration of how much detail he offered after each one. They sat in that kitchen until 2:30 in the morning, and the house was completely quiet and the tea had gone cold, and neither of them had moved to make more. There's a name, she said finally. You keep stopping just before it, someone in the organization. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Min Seok. Who is he? Was, he said. Jung Min Seok. He was my underboss for 6 years. He handled the Eastern operations and the domestic financial restructuring, a pause that had texture to it. I removed him 18 months ago. Why? He was skimming, not catastrophically, but consistently. And when I confronted him about it, he stopped. Instead of a conversation, he came back with a counteraccusation. Claimed that I had authorized the diversions, that it had been my instruction. Had it? No. And you couldn't prove that. I could. I did. The council reviewed it. He was removed. Taejin set his cup down. He didn't take the removal as a conclusion. He took it as a beginning. Nia looked at him. Where is he now? Somewhere he can afford to be patient, Taejin said. Which means he has backing I haven't fully traced. She absorbed this. She thought about the architecture of it. Seorin with her dynasty and her 15-year preparation and her cold, backward-working intelligence. Min Seok with his resentment and his patience and his unknown backing. Two separate grievances with a shared target, moving on their own timelines. They're going to find each other, she said. He looked at her. If they haven't already, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That was longer than his usual pauses. That's what I've been trying to determine, he said. And and I don't have a clean answer. Nia looked at the table. Her hands were still. Her breathing was steady. She thought about all the things she had never been told in the years she spent in that other house. The legal structures, the documents, the decisions made above her without her knowledge, and the way that not knowing had not protected her, but had simply meant that the harm arrived without warning. I want to meet the people who are loyal to you, she said. The ones you trust. Not to perform being your wife. I want to meet them because I need to be able to read a room, and I can't read a room full of people I've never seen. He nodded slowly. There's a meeting Thursday, mid-level. I can have you present. Not as a guest. He held her gaze. Not as a guest, he agreed. She stood. It was nearly 3. The kitchen had the particular stillness of a late hour, and a conversation that had moved something in the architecture of things. Taijin, she said. He looked up. The next time someone arrives at this house with a history I don't know about, don't wait for me to come inside. Come find me. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded. One small, deliberate nod. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about Seorin's voice, and the specific weight of those 2 words, it will, and then she thought about Min Seok, whom she had never met and whose face she did not know, sitting somewhere patient in his resentment, waiting. The Thursday meeting was 12 people in the East Conference Room, a room Nia had passed but not entered, with a long table and windows that looked onto the garden she had claimed. She came in without introduction and sat at the end of the table nearest the door, which was a choice she made deliberately and which she saw 2 people register. One registered it with a brief neutral flicker. The other registered it with a slightly longer look that had something under it she filed for later. Taejin introduced her without apology and without elaboration. My wife, Naya. She has full standing in this room. And then he moved on, and the meeting moved on, and Nia watched 12 people react to her presence for 90 minutes. She counted 3 who were comfortable, 4 who were cautious in a way that felt professional rather than personal, 2 who were performing comfort, and 2 who were blank in the specific way of people who have been trained to be blank in the presence of unknowns, and 1, a man at the far left of the table, perhaps 50, with gray at his temples, and a way of holding his pen that suggested it was not actually a pen to him but a prop, who looked at her once, very early in the meeting, with an expression that was so briefly and completely cold that by the time she had processed it, it was gone. She did not look at him again for the rest of the meeting. She didn't need to. She had what she needed. After, she found Taejin alone in the hallway. The man at the far left of the table, she said. Gray temples, dark jacket, held his pen wrong. Taejin went still. He looked at me like I was already gone, she said. He turned to face her fully. His name is Baek Sung-ho. He's been with the organization for 22 years. Is he one of the ones you trust? A pause that was just a fraction too long. He was. Was, she said. Was, he confirmed. She looked at him. Then you already knew. I suspected, and you brought me into that room anyway. I needed to see if you could read it, he said, and I needed to see what he would do when there was something new in the room to react to. Nia breathed through the flash of anger that moved through her. Not at his reasoning, which was sound, but at the specific texture of being used as a diagnostic tool without being told that was what was happening. Don't do that again, she said. Use me as bait without telling me I'm bait. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. That's not the point. The point is that you agreed last night to stop making decisions about what I know without telling me, and then this morning. You're right, he said again, quieter this time, in the tone of a man who means it. She held on to the anger for another 3 seconds and then let it go, because holding it wasn't the use of it. Baek Sung-ho, she said. What's his connection to Min Seok? The question landed, and she watched it land, and she saw in his face the specific expression of a man whose internal conclusion has just been confirmed by an external voice. They trained under the same man, he said, 15 years ago. Then they've already found each other, she said. This isn't a future problem. He looked at her, not with the contained stillness of pressure this time, with something that was less armored and more present, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she could see clearly in his face something that was not yet named between them, but had stopped being deniable. I need to make some calls, he said. Make them, she said, and then tell me what you find. He went. She stood in the hallway and looked at the door to the conference room, which was still slightly open, and thought about the 12 faces around that table and the one that had been cold, and she thought about Seorin in her precise clothes moving backward from outcome. And she thought about a man named Min Sok, sitting somewhere patient with 22 years of institutional knowledge, now sitting at the table next to his resentment. The pieces were moving. She had not chosen to be on this board, but she was on it, and the board did not have an off-ramp, and the woman who had spent 3 years mopping someone else's floors and losing without being asked had decided, somewhere between the midnight kitchen and the conference room and her father's notebooks on the storage room floor, that she was done losing things she hadn't chosen to put up. She was still in the hallway when Mrs. Park appeared with the quiet urgency she reserved for things that required immediate attention. Her face was that careful blankness again, but this time there was something underneath it that Nia had not seen before in 2.5 weeks of watching this woman manage the impossible with perfect composure. It was the specific expression of someone who has received information they wish they hadn't. "Mrs. Park," Nia said. "What happened?" Mrs. Park looked at her. She pressed her lips together for just a moment, the smallest hesitation, and then she said, "There's been a message for you specifically, not for Mr. Kang." Nia went very still. "From who?" Mrs. Park handed her a small envelope. White. No exterior marking. Nia opened it. Inside was a single card, the kind used for formal correspondence, and on it, in handwriting that was elegant and precise and utterly controlled, were 6 words. She read them once, then again. Then she folded the card and put it in her pocket and walked to the window at the end of the hall and stood there with her hand pressed flat against the glass, and her breathing doing something she needed to bring back under control. Because the 6 words on that card were not a threat. They were worse than a threat. A threat can be defended against. What was written on that card was a demonstration, a proof of reach, a proof of knowledge, a proof that someone had been watching carefully enough and long enough to know the one thing that, if it became public in the wrong room to the wrong people, would not just endanger Nia's position in this house. It would give Taejin's enemies exactly the weapon they needed to justify removing her permanently. The card said, "We know about the $200. So does everyone who needs to." 6 words that weren't 6 words. They were a detonation with a delay timer, and Nia was standing at the window with her hand on the glass, counting the seconds before the shockwave hit. She did not go to Taejin immediately. She stood at the window for 3 full minutes and let her breathing do what it needed to do and made herself think rather than react, because reacting was what they wanted. Whoever had sent the card wanted her to run to him in a panic, wanted to watch her destabilize, wanted the first version of this information that reached the room to be a frightened woman with a card in her hand instead of a controlled one. She was not going to give them that. She put the card in her pocket. She found Mrs. Park still in the hallway, standing with the careful stillness of a woman who had delivered something and was waiting to understand what it had cost. "How did this arrive?" Nia said. "A courier. Front gate. It was addressed to you by name." "How did they know my name?" Mrs. Park's expression did something small and uncomfortable. "Everyone knows your name," she said quietly. "They have for some time." Nia looked at her. "How long?" "Since the day you arrived." She absorbed this. She thought about the conference room and the 12 faces and the cold man with the gray temples who had looked at her once and then looked away. And she understood now that she had not been an unknown quantity for as long as she had believed. She had been watched from the beginning. Categorized. Assessed. She had thought she was learning the room. The room had already finished learning her. She went to find Taejin. He was in his study, on the phone, and she opened the door without knocking, something she had not done before. And he looked up and registered her face and ended the call in 2 words. She put the card on the desk in front of him. He read it. His face did not change in any visible way, but his right hand, which was resting on the desk, pressed flat against the surface with a pressure that was not casual. "When did this arrive?" he said. 10 minutes ago. Front gate. Courier." "Mrs. Park has the couriers? It won't lead anywhere," Nia said. "It was meant to arrive. It wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted me to have it, and they wanted me to bring it to you, and they wanted to watch what happens next." He looked at the card again, then at her. "You're not panicking." "I told you I was done being handled." She sat down across from him. "Who knows about the $200? You said Dong-soo and 2 others." "Yes." "Then one of those 3 told someone, or was asked by someone who already knew part of it and needed confirmation." He picked up the card. held it. Dongsu has been with me for 11 years. I'd stake my life on him. You might be staking mine, she said. Who are the other two? He said the names. She didn't know them, but she watched his face as he said them, and she saw the specific quality of a man performing certainty he is privately revising. The second name, she said. Your face did something. He set the card down. Park Hyun-jae. He handled the initial contact with Celine's network. He's had some financial difficulties in the last year, personal debts. And someone with money and a reason to want this information could have reached him. Taejin did not answer, which was itself an answer. Seo-rin, Nia said, or Min-seok, or both. He stood. He moved to the window, the same window she had stood at, the one that overlooked the front drive, and stood with his back to her for a moment. When he turned around, his face had the contained stillness again, but she could see beneath it now, could read the specific frequency of it. This was not the stillness of a man managing external pressure. This was the stillness of a man managing the recognition that something he thought was secure is not, and has not been, and the radius of the breach is still expanding. I need to talk to Hyun-jae, he said. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. If you move on him now, whoever sent this card knows within hours that we identified the leak. They'll accelerate whatever they're planning. She held his gaze. You said Seo-rin works backward from outcome. If she sent this, she sent it as a first move, not a last one. She wants us reactive. She wants us making decisions fast and making them afraid. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? I want to know what everyone who needs to means. Who is the target audience for this information? Who are they planning to tell and when and in what context? If it reaches the council, he began. What happens? He pressed his lips together. The legitimacy of the marriage becomes a formal question. There are members who had concerns about the circumstances. If it becomes a council matter, I can manage it. But it creates a window. And during that window, the organization's attention is divided between the external question and internal politics. And that's exactly the kind of opening Min-seok has been waiting to exploit. So the card isn't the attack, Nia said. The card is what makes the door. He looked at her. Yes. Then we have to close the door before they walk through it. She leaned forward. Tell me about the council. Who sits on it? Which ones have existing reasons to question your judgment? He told her. 4 names. Of the 4, 2 were neutral, men who followed organizational precedent rather than personal loyalty. One was fully in his corner. One was Baek Sung-ho, the cold man with the gray temples and the wrong pen, who had been with the organization for 22 years and had trained with Jung Min-seok 15 years ago, and had looked at Nia once in that conference room with an expression like she was already a past tense problem. How much does Sung-ho know about the Seo-rin engagement? She said. Everything. He was part of the original negotiation. So he has a loyalty to the alliance that predates his loyalty to your current decisions. In some respects, yes. And if the $200 story reaches him in the right framing, he calls for a formal review, Taejin said, which requires me to appear before the full council and account for the circumstances of the marriage, during which time, formally, organizational authority is held in committee. And Min-seok needs committee paralysis to move. Yes, Nia sat back. She pressed her fingers against each other and looked at the desk. Her mind was working in a way that felt cold and clean and slightly frightening, because it was the same part of her that had figured out Celine's legal structures at 17. The same part that had understood intuitively that you cannot fight someone with more power than you through direct confrontation. You have to understand the mechanism of what they're building and remove one critical piece before they finish building it. Hyun-jae, she said. Don't confront him. Bring him in. Tell him you've heard a rumor that someone is trying to access information about the marriage arrangement. Tell him you need him to quietly monitor for any inquiries coming from Seo-rin's network or Min-seok's contacts. Tell him you trust him specifically. Taejin watched her. If he's already been compromised, he'll warn whoever turned him, and then we watch the reaction. Where it comes from, how fast, what shape it takes. That tells us what they know and what their timeline is. She looked at him, and if he hasn't been compromised, he becomes an actual asset. You're using him as a sensor, Taejin said. The card used me as a sensor. I'm returning the approach. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the study windows at an angle that caught the edge of the desk and the corner of his face, and she thought about the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning and the notebooks on the storage room floor and the specific accumulation of days that had brought her to this desk, in this chair, in this house. And she thought, this is the thing I can do, this specific thing, this navigation of people who are trying to remove you without showing their hands. She had been trained in this, without wanting to be, by 3 years in Celine's house. All right, he said. He made the call to Hyunjae that evening. She was not in the room. That was her choice, not his. She waited in the garden and listened to the birds settle for the evening and kept her hands still in her lap. When he came out to the garden 40 minutes later, his face told her before he spoke. He asked 2 questions, Tae-jin said. Questions that someone who was genuinely monitoring for external inquiries would not have needed to ask. What questions? He asked whether the council had already been informed, and he asked whether Dong-soo knew I was making this request. Nia closed her eyes for 1 second. He's checking the boundary of what's already compromised. Yes. How long do we have before he reports back? Hours? Maybe less. She stood. Then we don't have the timeline I thought we had. She looked at him. What can you do tonight? Right now, tonight. I can brief the 2 neutral council members before Sung-ho can reach them. Give them the full account of the marriage, the real account, including the $200, directly from me, with context before they hear it as an accusation. Remove the shock value. Do it, she said. And Dong-soo, where is he? 20 minutes from here. Get him here. If Hyunjae reports to Min-sok's network tonight, we need someone we trust inside the gate. He was already moving. The next 4 hours were the most precise and controlled chaos Nia had experienced since the day Celine had announced the arrangement over a kitchen floor. And she had experienced that day with no resources and no allies and no understanding of the architecture of what was coming. Tonight, she had none of the first 2 things and a rapidly developing grasp of the third, which was not enough, but was not nothing. Tae-jin reached both neutral council members before midnight. She was not in those calls, but she sat outside the study and listened to the cadence of his voice through the door. Not the words, just the rhythm. And tracked the shape of each conversation by the pauses and the register. Both ran long. One ran very long. Neither ended badly. She could hear that much. Dong-soo arrived at 11:15. She had not met him before. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a face that did not advertise its intelligence but contained it. And he looked at Nia when he came through the door with a directness that was not impolite but was entirely without performance. He told me about you, Dong-soo said. When he decided. What did he tell you? She said. That you had your father's eyes and your stepmother's address, and not a single person in the world looking out for you. He paused, and that he wanted to change the second and third things. She held his gaze. He was wrong about the first, she said. I have my own eyes. Dong-soo looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He smiled briefly, with the specific quality of someone who has just confirmed something. Yes, he said. I can see that. She briefed him on Hyunjae herself, with Tae-jin beside her, and she did it with the same precision she had used to lay it out for Tae-jin earlier. Dong-soo listened without interrupting, which was the listening style of a man who was building a complete picture rather than collecting fragments. When she finished, he looked at Tae-jin. She's right about the timeline, he said. If Hyunjae moves tonight, Sung-ho calls an emergency session by morning. Can you intercept the message? Tae-jin said. I can delay it. 6, maybe 8 hours. Dong-soo's jaw was set. But that only changes when, not what. 8 hours is enough to finish the council outreach, Nia said. If both neutral members have the full story from him directly before Sung-ho can frame it as a betrayal of the organization, the emergency session has no quorum for removal. Dong-soo looked at her again, then at Tae-jin, then back at her. Where did you find her? He said. Train tracks, Tae-jin said. And the specific dry weight of the answer, the absurdity and the accuracy of it, landed in the room and both men held it for a moment. Nia did not find it funny, but she found it, for the first time in 3 weeks, something adjacent to bearable. The night moved. Tae-jin finished the council calls at 1 in the morning. Both members, a man named Cho and a woman named Yoon, which were all the names Nia was given, had agreed to hear the full account in person the following day rather than accepting a secondhand version from any other source. It was not a victory. It was a delay of the mechanism. But delays were what they had. She was in the kitchen at 2 when Dong-su found her. His face had the particular quality it had lacked all evening, a tightness around the jaw that had not been there before. Hyun-jae already moved, he said, 3 hours ago, before I could get to his communications. She set her cup down. So the 8 hours? Already spent. Sung-ho has been contacted. She looked at the wall above the kitchen counter, breathed. Then the morning session is certain. Yes. And Min-seok. Dong-su's jaw tightened further. He placed his hands on the counter and looked at them. There's been movement on 3 of the eastern distribution channels in the past 2 hours. Routing changes. Not large enough to trigger the automated flags, but consistent with someone pre-positioning assets. He's getting ready to move, she said. He was already moving. He's been moving for weeks. The card wasn't Seorin's opening move. Dong-su looked at her. It was the signal. The thing that told Min-seok the operation was live. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, Tae-jin was still in his study. The gate was manned. The house was locked. And outside, in the dark, 2 separate operations were converging on the same point. She found Tae-jin in the study and told him what Dong-su had said, and watched his face perform the specific rapid internal calculation of a man revising his threat assessment in real time. He was good at this. She had watched him do it before, and each time she was struck by the absence of panic. Not because he didn't feel it, she knew now that he did, but because for him the panic and the calculation were not sequential. They ran simultaneously, and the calculation always emerged first. I need to call my grandfather, he said. She had not expected that. The estranged grandfather. Do-hyun. He said the name with a weight that belonged to a much longer conversation. He's the only person who has intelligence networks deep enough to know what Min-seok's external backing actually is. Without that, I'm defending against a shape I can't see. You said they were estranged. We are. Will he help? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know. That's not good enough for tonight. No, he said. It isn't. He picked up a phone, not the one she had seen him use before, a different one, older, the kind that does not connect to networks, and dialed a number from memory. He held the phone to his ear and stood with his back straight and his other hand at his side, and she saw in his posture the specific quality of a man preparing for a conversation he has been avoiding for a long time. The call connected. She could hear the faint sound of a voice on the other end. Old, careful, alert in the way of a man who has never fully stopped watching. Tae-jin spoke in Korean. She could not follow the words, but she followed the register. The compressed quality of it, the specific formality of a man addressing someone he has hurt and has not spoken to and is calling now from the bottom of a very deep problem. He spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he stopped and listened. His face during the listening was the most unguarded she had seen it. When he ended the call, he stood for a moment with the phone in his hand before setting it down. He'll send what he has, Tae-jin said. By morning. What did he say? Tae-jin turned to face her. His face was still doing the thing it had done during the call. The unguarded quality, something below the operational surface. He said he had been waiting for me to need him again. A pause. And that he was glad I had someone with me who could hold a situation steady while I made the call. She looked at him. He knows about me. He's known since the day you arrived. Tae-jin held her gaze. He had you looked into within 48 hours. He said, started again. He said that a woman who survives what you survived and still comes to the table instead of running away from it is the only kind of woman worth building anything with. Nia stood in the study and felt the specific weight of being seen by a person she had never met, assessed by a man whose intelligence networks apparently reached all the way into the particular grief of a 20-year-old girl in a storage room at 3 a.m. with her dead father's notebooks. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. Try to sleep, she said. One of us should. Nia. He said her name the way he had not said it before. Not as an address, not as the beginning of a sentence. Just her name, with a weight in it that was its own complete statement. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't gotten to morning. But morning got to them first. She was still in bed, the thin sleep of a person who has not truly let go of consciousness, when the sound reached her. Not an alarm, not a crash, something quieter and therefore worse. The specific, controlled urgency of voices in the hallway moving fast. She was at the door before she was fully awake. Dong-soo was in the hallway with two men she recognized from the gate rotation, and his face had moved entirely beyond control into something that was not panic. He was too trained for panic, but was its functional equivalent in a man like him, pure, cold, operational dread. "What happened?" she said. 20 minutes ago, he said. 3 vehicles. They came in from the east access point, which has a 20-second gap in the rotation at 4:15. He looked at her, and his jaw was so tight she could hear the compression of it in his voice. "They took you." She stared at him. "What?" "They came for you. They had a vehicle at the east garden wall. They knew your pattern, the morning walks, the bench in the corner." His eyes were steady on hers with the intensity of a man delivering a detonation. "They were 40 minutes early. You weren't there." The hallway swam slightly. She pressed her hand against the wall. "Where is Tae-jin?" "He's—" The door at the end of the hall opened. Tae-jin came through it with Dong-soo's mirror of expression on his face, past control into something that operated below the normal channels of composure. And he crossed the hallway in 6 steps and stopped in front of her with his hands at his sides and his chest moving with a breath that was doing more work than breathing usually requires. He looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just understood he cannot afford to lose. "They tried to take me," she said. "Yes." "They knew my schedule." "Yes." "Sung-ho," she said, "or someone with access to the estate's internal rotation schedule." His jaw was iron, which narrows to 6 people. She absorbed this. She stood in the hallway of a house with armed men at the gates and a council session at dawn, and a man named Min Seok repositioning assets in the dark, and an attempt on her specifically that had missed by 40 minutes because she had not been able to sleep. She thought about the bench in the garden, the corner under the tree, the place she had gone every morning because it was the one part of this estate she had claimed as hers. They had watched her claim it. They had built an operation around it. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes," Dong-soo said. "They'll recalibrate and come back." "Then I can't stay here," she said. The words came out flat and certain, and she felt them as she said them, not as defeat, but as the specific recognition of a tactical reality. "I'm a target they've already located. Staying here gives them a fixed point and a known pattern, and eventually they'll get the timing right. I'm not sending you somewhere alone," Tae-jin said. The words came out with a force that was not a command, but was something rawer than that. "I'm not asking you to," she said. She looked at him directly. "I'm saying we stop reacting. We stop waiting for them to move, and we move first." She held his gaze. "Your grandfather, Do-hyun. You said he'd have the intelligence on Min Seok's backing by morning." "Yes. Then we go to him. Tonight. Right now." She looked at Dong-soo. "Can you get us out of here without the east access point knowing we've gone?" Dong-soo looked at Tae-jin. Something passed between them. An old shorthand. Tae-jin gave him a single nod. 15 minutes, Dong-soo said. Nia went to her room. She moved with the specific economy of someone who has packed under pressure before. Not from safety, from flight, and the muscle memory of it was still there in her hands, even after 3 weeks of beds with good sheets and thermostats that worked. She took her bag. She took her father's notebooks, which she had moved to the room because she was not leaving them again for someone else to throw away. She was back in the hallway in 11 minutes. Tae-jin was waiting. He had a jacket on and his face had closed back down to the operational stillness, but she could see beneath it now, and what was beneath it was not stillness at all. It was a man who had looked at an empty garden bench at 4 in the morning and understood in the specific way that understanding sometimes arrives, not as thought, not as conclusion, but as a physical impact in the chest, that he had been wrong about what mattered most to him. She did not say anything about this. She understood that now was not the moment for it. She stood beside him and looked at Dong-soo. "Let's go," she said. But as Dong-soo moved toward the east corridor and the vehicle waiting beyond the garden wall, one of the gate guards appeared at the far end of the hallway with a phone in his hand and a look on his face that stopped everyone in the hallway in the same breath. "Sir," the guard said to Tae-jin, "it's Min Seok. He's on the external line. He says—" The guard paused, and in the pause was the specific quality of a man who has heard something he did not expect to hear and is still processing it. He says he already has her. Nia felt the hallway tilt. Taejin turned slowly to look at her, and she looked back at him, and for 3 full seconds, neither of them spoke, because neither of them yet understood what Min-seok meant by a claim that was physically impossible. She was standing right here, she was right here, until the guard said the second part. He says he has Celine Brooks, the guard said, and he says she's been very forthcoming. Taejin took the phone. Nia watched his face during the 30 seconds he listened. She had become, in 3 weeks, a reader of that face. Its compressions and releases, the specific architecture of how it managed information, and what she saw now was something she had not seen before. Not anger, not calculation, something beneath both of those. The thing that lives under a man's controlled surface, when the controlled surface is no longer the priority. "Put her on," he said. A pause. Then a woman's voice through the phone, thin and compressed by the line, and even at distance and through a speaker, Nia could hear the quality of it, the particular register of a person speaking under duress while trying not to demonstrate that they are. Celine Brooks, performing composure from somewhere she had not chosen to be. "Taejin," Celine's voice, controlled, almost. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Not yet." A breath. "They've been very direct about what they want." "Put Min-seok on." Another pause. Then a different voice. A man's voice, Korean, with the particular cadence of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific phone call and is now savoring the architecture of the moment. "Boss," Min-seok said. The word carried its history. "Where?" Taejin said. "You know the Meridian Warehouse Complex, South Dock, Building 7. A pause with something embedded in it. "Come alone. Transfer documentation for the full asset structure. Every account, every holding, every operational network, signed and executable. You have 4 hours." Another pause, longer this time, engineered for maximum weight. "And bring the wife." The call ended. The hallway was completely silent. Nia could hear her own pulse. Not fast. Her pulse was not fast, which was its own information about what she was becoming in this house, in this situation, in the accumulation of nights that had rebuilt something in her that Celine's house had spent 3 years dismantling. Taejin lowered the phone. "He wants the organization," Dong-soo said. It was not a question. "Everything signed over, executable tonight." "It's a trap," Dong-soo said. "Even if you comply." "I know. He'll execute both of you anyway. He can't leave you alive with what you know about his—" "I know," Taejin said again. The 2 words landed with a flatness that was not resignation. It was the flatness of a man who has already moved past the analysis into the space where decisions are made. Nia looked at him. "You're going?" "Yes." "With the documentation?" "Yes." Even knowing it's a trap. He turned to look at her and his face had something in it that she had seen once before. On the night of the attempted abduction, in the hallway, when he had looked at the empty garden bench and understood something at the level below thought. "She's there because of me," he said. "Because I made the arrangement through her network. Whatever she is, whatever she did to you, she's there because of me." Nia looked at him. She thought about Celine, the kitchen floors, the documents, the $200, the smile. She thought about being 17 and having no one. "I'm coming with you," she said. "No." "He asked for both of us. If I'm not in that car, he executes her before you reach the building." She held his gaze. "You know that." His jaw was iron. "Nia, I know what I'm walking into," she said. "That's different from not walking in." The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. Then Dong-soo said quietly, "She's right about Min-seok's sequence. He'll move on the hostage the moment the vehicle arrives without her." Taejin looked at Dong-soo, then back at Nia. The thing in his face was raw, and she did not look away from it. "All right," he said. The words cost him something. Dong-soo moved. He was on his phone before he cleared the hallway, speaking in rapid Korean, and Nia could hear in the cadence of it that he was building something. Not a plan yet, but the skeleton of one, the rapid assembly of pieces from available materials. She had come to understand that Dongsu's mind operated like a man running calculations he had already run before in different configurations. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed for 90 seconds. She did not pray. She did not look at the ceiling. She looked at her hands in her lap, and she thought about her father. Not the grief of him, not the loss, but the specific quality of the man, the particular way he had held himself when things were hard. Edward Okafor had not been a large man or a loud one. He had been a man who understood that the resolution of difficult things required the willingness to be present for the difficulty rather than managing it from a distance. She picked up the bag. She left the notebooks on the bed. She could not afford to be carrying anything that was not essential. The drive to the Meridian complex took 22 minutes. She sat beside Taejin in the back of the vehicle and did not speak, and he did not speak, and the city moved past the dark windows in the particular way it moves at 4:30 in the morning, emptied of its ordinary traffic, reduced to its essential shapes. She was aware of him with a specificity she could not categorize. The warmth of him, the weight of him in the seat beside her, the sound of his breathing, which was controlled but not slow. He reached over and put his hand over hers. She did not pull away. She did not say anything. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for the remainder of the drive, in the dark, not speaking, which was more honest than anything either of them had said in 3 weeks. The Meridian warehouse complex sat at the edge of the old industrial port, a cluster of enormous structures that had once served active shipping operations and now existed in the particular limbo of buildings that are too large and expensive to demolish and too outdated for legitimate repurposing. Building 7 was the southernmost, backing onto a section of dock that had been decommissioned for years. The approach road was lit by 2 working lampposts out of 8, which was either neglect or design. Their vehicle stopped 200 meters from the building. Dong-Su was in the front seat. He had said almost nothing during the drive. He turned now. 14 minutes, he said, after you enter. Taejin nodded. Nia looked at the building, at the distance between the vehicle and the door, at the lampposts that worked and the ones that didn't, and the specific geometry of what was illuminated and what was left in dark. There are men on the roof, she said, left side. I can see the silhouette shift every 90 seconds. That's a rotation. Both men looked at the roofline. She's right, Dong-Su said quietly. At least 2 positions, Nia said. Maybe 3. And there's someone at the vehicle entrance, east side. The lamppost there is out, but you can see a different quality of dark near the shutter door. Taejin looked at her. I've been watching the light change in this complex for 6 minutes, she said. While you were talking, he held her gaze. When we're inside, he said carefully, stay close to me. Not behind me. Beside me. I need to see your position. I know. And if I tell you to move, I'll move, she said, but you have to trust me to read the room. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he opened the door. They walked across the approach road with the particular weight of people who understand that they are being watched and have decided to perform the opposite of fear. Taejin carried a document folder, the transfer documentation, which Nia knew, and he knew, and Dong-Su knew, was not what it appeared to be, but which needed to appear genuine for the first 4 minutes of whatever was about to happen. She walked beside him, exactly beside him, not behind, as he had asked. The door to Building 7 was a standard personnel entrance set into the larger shutter frame. It was unlocked. This too was a message. We were ready for you. We have been ready. The terms of this arrival were set by us. Inside was darkness, and then, as her eyes adjusted, not darkness. Suspended work lights, 3 of them, created pools of harsh white in the center of the space. The building was cavernous. The smell of it was rust and standing water and something chemical that had been there for years. The concrete floor was broken in places. Steel I-beams ran overhead at intervals. In the center pool of light, a chair. In the chair, Celine. Nia saw her and felt the specific complex temperature of it. The woman who had sold her, who had stolen 3 years of her life, who had handed her to a stranger for $200, sitting in a chair in a warehouse with her wrists bound and her composure performing at full strength despite everything. Because Celine Brooks had never in her life permitted herself to look afraid in front of anyone, and apparently a rival crime organization's hostage situation was not going to be the exception. Their eyes met. Celine's face did something, a flicker, fast and involuntary, that Nia read as the specific expression of a person confronting a consequence they calculated but did not fully believe would materialize. Nia, Celine said. Her voice was steady. Almost. Nia said nothing. Minsuk stepped out of the dark at the edge of the light pool. She knew him immediately, not from a photograph, she had never been shown one, but from the specific quality of his presence. He was perhaps 55, heavier than she had imagined, with the physical weight of a man who had once been conditioned and had spent the past 18 months eating his resentment. His face was not the face of a man celebrating. It was the face of a man completing a transaction he had decided on long ago. Beside him, slightly behind, Baek Sung-ho. Gray temples, dark jacket. The cold face she had catalogued in the conference room 2 weeks ago and filed for later. Later was now. "You brought her," Min-seok said. He looked at Nia with the particular quality of a man assessing a tool. "Good." "The documentation," Tae-jin said. He held up the folder. "Set it on the floor." Tae-jin set it on the floor. Min-seok looked at Sung-ho. Sung-ho moved forward and picked up the folder and opened it and examined the first pages. His face registered something, a frown, small and fast. "These need verification," Sung-ho said. "They're executed and notarized," Tae-jin said. "Every account, every network, every holding, everything you asked for." Min-seok looked at him. "Why so cooperative?" "Because you have something I don't want to lose." Min-seok's eyes moved to Nia. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not like, not because it was threatening, but because it was assessing in the way of a man filing information for later use. "Funny," he said. "What a man will give up for a woman he's known 3 weeks." "Release the woman in the chair," Tae-jin said, "and we're done here. We're done when I say we're done." Min-seok turned to one of the men at the edge of the light, 4 of them visible, she had counted, and said something in Korean. The man moved towards Celine. Nia watched his hands. He reached behind the chair and she heard the sound of the binding being cut, and Celine stood, slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose hands had been restricted for hours, and whose body was managing the return of circulation. Celine took 2 steps toward Nia and stopped. She looked at her stepdaughter in the harsh light of a decommissioned warehouse at 5 in the morning and said, quietly, in a voice stripped of its usual performance, "I'm sorry." The 2 words landed in a way Nia was not prepared for. She had prepared for many things in the drive over. She had not prepared for a genuine apology from a woman she had never heard apologize for anything. She looked at Celine and felt the specific complexity of a person who has been wronged deeply and irrevocably, and is being handed something that looks like accountability 3 years too late, and in the worst possible location. "I know," Nia said. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. The difference mattered. Min-seok was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who considers emotional content irrelevant to his objectives and is waiting for it to conclude. When the brief silence that followed Nia's 2 words settled, he looked at Tae-jin. "There's one more thing," he said. Tae-jin's jaw. "Sung-ho." Min-seok gestured. Sung-ho pulled a phone from his jacket and turned the screen toward Tae-jin. On it, a document. Nia could not read it from where she stood, but she could see from Tae-jin's face as he looked at it that it was something that had weight. "Emergency council session was called 40 minutes ago," Sung-ho said. "Formal review of the Baeko leadership has been initiated. Per organizational charter, during a formal review, no executive transfer of assets is legally valid without council countersignature." He looked at Tae-jin with the cold face. "The documents you brought are worthless." Min-seok smiled. It was a small smile. The smile of a man who has run the sequence and confirmed the outcome. "So here's what happens now," he said. "You both stay here while I go to the council session and present the evidence of your, shall we say, irregular marriage arrangement. The council removes you. New leadership is seated. Countersignature is obtained, and the documents become valid." "You're going to kill us anyway," Tae-jin said. Flat. A statement, not an accusation. Min-seok looked at him. "I'm going to do what's necessary," he said, which is a phrase you used to say yourself, if I remember correctly. He said something to the 4 men at the edge of the light. They moved. Nia watched their movement and calculated it, and her calculation arrived at an outcome she did not like, and she felt her body react before her mind had finished processing. The cold down her spine, the tightening of her chest, the specific adrenaline that is not fear, but is fear's functional component being routed toward use. She looked at Tae-jin and found him already looking at her. In his eyes was the calculation she recognized, but beneath it, the other thing, the thing that had been building for 3 weeks and had clarified completely on the drive over when he had reached across the dark and put his hand over hers. One of the men raised his weapon. She saw the angle of it. She saw the target. She saw the distance and the moment, the specific compression of seconds that precedes a thing that cannot be undone. And she moved. Not away. Toward. She stepped in front of him with the particular speed of a person who has made a decision before the decision has been consciously formed, and she felt the impact before she heard the sound. A hard, searing translation of force into her left side, high, below the shoulder, that drove the breath out of her and replaced it with something that burned clean and immediate and absolute. She was falling before she understood she had been hit. Tae-jin caught her. His arms were around her and the floor was very far away and very close at the same time, and she could hear his voice saying her name. Not in the composed register, not in any register she had heard from him before, in the register of a man for whom the composed surface has been entirely removed by a single irreversible second. She heard the warehouse erupt, sound and motion and the particular chaos of a situation that has departed from its planned sequence. She heard Dong-su's voice, the 14 minutes, he had said 14 minutes, and she had lost count of time in the drive and the crossing and the light pool, and she heard other voices and the specific sounds of a space that has gone from controlled to contested. She was on the floor. He was beside her, over her, with his hand pressed hard against her side and his face above her in the harsh white light, and his eyes. She could see his eyes clearly. She was not losing consciousness. The pain was large and specific and present, and she was entirely in it. His eyes were doing something she had never seen them do. They were not contained. They were not calculating. They were the eyes of a man who has been stripped down to what remains when everything else is removed, and what remained was not the boss or the strategist or the man who had walked away from an empire to find out if he was still human. What remained was grief. The particular grief of a person who has found the one thing and is watching it cost. "Stay with me," he said. His voice was raw in a way that physical damage alone does not produce. "Nia, stay with me." She looked up at him from the concrete floor with the burning in her side and the chaos of the warehouse around them and the specific weight of 3 weeks compressed into this one moment, and she thought, "I am not going anywhere." She tried to say it. What came out was less than that, but it was something, and he heard it, and she watched his face receive it. The warehouse was changing. She could hear it in the quality of the sounds. The movement had shifted. The voices had changed their direction, the specific acoustic signature of a space where one side is gaining. Dong-su! Whatever 14 minutes had assembled, it was here. Min Seok's voice somewhere in the dark, raised. Sung-ho's answering. Then other voices overriding them, and the particular silence of men who were positioned and prepared encountering men who were positioned and prepared in the opposite direction and discovering that their arithmetic had been wrong. She kept her eyes on Tae-jin's face. His hand was still pressed against her side. She could feel the pressure of it, steady, hard, deliberate. A man who understood that pressure was the immediate physics of what was needed and was providing it without flinching. His other hand was on the side of her face. "The grandfather," she said. Her voice was thin. She did not like how thin it was. "He came," Tae-jin said. She absorbed this. Do-hyun, the intelligence networks. The 14 minutes that had become something else entirely. Not just Dong-su's preparation, but something older and deeper. The resources of a man who had built the organization from nothing and had been waiting, in his estrangement, for his grandson to need him enough to call. "Good," she said. "Don't talk." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I'm talking," she said. "That means I'm fine enough." He looked at her and his face was doing the unguarded thing, and she looked back at him, and somewhere in the warehouse the sounds of the operation were resolving, the controlled chaos settling into the specific quality of an aftermath, and she thought, "We are going to be here when the dust settles." She thought, "I am going to be here." But the pain in her side was very large now, spreading in a way that had changed quality from the first sharp translation to something deeper and more systemic, and she felt her body beginning to do the thing bodies do when they are managing something serious. The coldness in her hands, the narrowing of her peripheral vision, the particular tiredness that is not ordinary tiredness. And she looked at Tae-jin's face above her, and she held onto his eyes the way a person holds onto something fixed when the ground is moving. "Hospital," she said. "I know." His voice cracked on the word, just slightly, just enough. Don't fall apart, she said. Not yet. He looked at her, and his jaw was working against something, and his eyes were bright in the harsh light, and he said, very quietly, with the specific quality of a man making a promise in the only register that counts, "Not until you're okay." "Then I'll stay conscious," she said. "You'll do more than that," he said. And the fierceness of it, the raw, unperformed fierceness of a man who has given away an empire tonight and is holding the only thing he was not willing to give, reached her through the pain and the cold and the narrowing edges. Outside the warehouse, somewhere in the dark, a vehicle was moving fast. And in the silence that was beginning to replace the chaos, Dong-su's voice, controlled and clear, called a name across the concrete floor. And the name he called was not Tae-jin's. It was hers. She did not die. This was the first fact of the morning, and it was not a small one. The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes, which Tae-jin knew because he counted every one of them in a private waiting room of a medical facility that did not appear on any public registry, staffed by people who had signed the kind of agreements that meant the work they did here was never discussed outside these walls. Do-hyun had built this place 15 years ago. It had served purposes Tae-jin had never let himself examine too closely. Tonight, it was the reason Nia Okafor was still breathing. He sat in the waiting room with his shirt still carrying her blood, dried now, darkened. And he did not change it because changing it would have required leaving the room, and he was not leaving the room. Dong-su had offered him a jacket. He had not taken it. Do-hyun arrived at 6:15 in the morning. Tae-jin heard him before he saw him. The particular cadence of an old man who still moves with the economy of someone trained to make no unnecessary sound. He came through the door, and he was smaller than Tae-jin remembered, or perhaps the room was larger, and his face carried the particular weathering of a man who has outlived most of his contemporaries and knows exactly why. They looked at each other across the waiting room. 3 years of silence. 3 years since the argument that had not been an argument but a severance. Tae-jin telling his grandfather what the organization had cost him, what the decades of violence and arrangement and bloodshed had removed from him, what a man looked like from the inside when every relationship he had was structured by fear or obligation. Do-hyun listening without defending. And then, in the silence after, saying only, "I know." Which was the most honest and most insufficient thing he could have said, and both of them had understood this simultaneously, and the silence had extended from that room into 3 years. Do-hyun crossed the waiting room and sat in the chair beside him. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Tae-jin's shirt. "She moved in front of you," the old man said. "Yes." "Why?" Tae-jin looked at his hands. "I don't know. I haven't asked her." Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. "I think you know," he said. Tae-jin did not answer. The old man reached over and placed one hand briefly on his grandson's arm. Not a grip, not a demonstration of force, just a contact. The specific weight of a hand that has done terrible things and is offering, at this late hour, the only currency it has left that is worth anything. "She'll live," Do-hyun said. "The surgeon told me. The bullet was high. It missed what it needed to miss." Tae-jin closed his eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the thing he had been holding rigid in his chest since the warehouse floor was permitted a fraction of release before he brought it back under control. Because there were still things that needed doing, and he could not do them from the floor of himself. "Min Seok," he said. "In custody," Do-hyun said. "Dong-su's people in mind between them. He is not comfortable." A pause with a precise quality. "He will confess." Men like Min Seok always confess when they understand that the architecture of their protection has been fully disassembled. Sung-ho. Also in custody. His cooperation has already begun. He is a man who attached himself to a cause rather than a person, which means when the cause fails, he reassesses his position with considerable speed. The council. Do-hyun exhaled slowly. The emergency session was convened at 4:30. By 6, Cho and Yoon had the full account of Min Seok's operation, the planted evidence, the coordinated approach through Hyunjae, the warehouse arrangement. The session was adjourned pending a full review of Sung-ho's activities. The old man paused. "Your position is not in question. It will need formal confirmation, but that is procedural now, not contested." Tae-jin nodded. He looked at the door at the far end of the room, the one that led to the corridor that led to the operating theater. "She went in front of you," Do-hyun said again. Not pressing. Returning to it. "Yes." A woman who 3 weeks ago was a stranger, who had every reason to... Do-hyun stopped, chose different words. Who had not chosen any of this. No. And she stepped in front of a weapon for you. Tae-jin looked at his grandfather. The old man's face was not performing sentiment. It was making an observation with the precision of someone who has spent a lifetime studying what people reveal when the situation is genuinely extreme. I know what that means, Tae-jin said quietly. I think, Do-hyun said, that you have known for some time. The surgeon came out at 7:43. He was a compact man in his 60s who spoke in the direct manner of someone who has learned that the people in waiting rooms do not need his performance of reassurance, but need his actual assessment, which Tae-jin had always respected. The bullet extracted cleanly, he said. No organ damage. Significant blood loss, which the transfusion has addressed. She will need 4 to 6 weeks of restricted activity. She will have pain. She will recover fully. He looked at Tae-jin. She is awake and has asked for you specifically. He was through the door before the surgeon finished the last sentence. The room was small and white and overlit in the way of medical spaces that have no interest in atmosphere. She was in the bed with monitors beside her and an IV line in her left arm, and the particular stillness of a person whose body has been through something and is now marshaling its resources with the serious intent of repair. Her face was pale in a way that was different from her usual coloring, and her eyes were open, and when he came through the door they found him immediately. He pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat and looked at her and did not speak because the speaking required him to first dismantle something in his chest that had been load-bearing all night and he needed a moment. You're wearing my blood, she said. Her voice was thin and hoarse, which the surgery and the tubes and the night would explain, but it was present. It was entirely hers. The flat, direct quality of it, the specific register of a woman who has never used extra words when the necessary ones will do. Yes, he said, that's dramatic. I wasn't thinking about optics. She looked at him. Her eyes moved over his face with the reading quality she had developed in 3 weeks that had always unsettled him slightly, the sense of being seen with more accuracy than he had consented to. You need to sleep, she said. Later. Tae-jin. Later, he said again. And his voice on her name had the quality it had acquired on the warehouse floor, the specific rawness of a register that has had its outer layer removed. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. Min Seok. Handled. The council. Handled. Sung Ho. Handled. She absorbed this. Your grandfather. He's outside. Something moved in her face. Not surprised. She had heard him in the warehouse. Dong-soo had confirmed his arrival when she had still been conscious enough to process it. Something more complicated than surprise. The specific expression of a person recalibrating what the word handled actually contains. He came, she said. When I called, he came. She was quiet for a moment. How long since you'd spoken? 3 years. She looked at the IV line in her arm. You called him because of me. I called him because I needed his intelligence networks, and I had run out of time. He paused. And because I needed to call him. The timing was yours. She turned to look at him. That's an honest answer. You asked for honest answers. I've been trying to provide them. The room was quiet except for the monitors. Outside the door, the low sounds of a facility in operation. She shifted slightly and then went still, which told him the movement had cost something. Don't, he said. I'm fine. You said that on the floor of the warehouse, too. And I was right then also. But she stayed still. Her hands were on the sheet in front of her, and he could see the effort in them, the particular controlled quality of someone managing pain through the discipline of not reacting to it. He reached over and put his hand over hers. The same gesture from the car, reversed. She looked at his hand for a moment. Why did you do it? He said. Move in front of me. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, Because I didn't want you to be shot. That's not a complete answer. It's the only one I have right now that I'm willing to say out loud. She looked at him. Ask me again when I'm not in a hospital bed connected to a machine. He held her gaze. I'll ask you again, he said. I know you will. The silence between them was the warmest silence she had experienced in this building, and she let herself rest in it, let her body receive the permission of it. That she did not have to be alert right now, did not have to be reading the room, did not have to be 2 steps ahead of anything. The machinery of what had been threatening them for weeks had been disassembled overnight. The space that remained was not comfortable. Recovery was not comfortable, and 3 weeks of accumulated tension did not evaporate because the immediate crisis had resolved. But it was real. It was theirs. "I need to do something," she said. "Before I'm fully recovered. I need you to help me do it." "What?" "Celine." He waited. "She's not my enemy anymore," Naya said. And the precision of that phrasing, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the specific removal of a category, was something she had been working out since the warehouse floor when the woman had said, "I'm sorry," in a stripped voice, and she had said, "I know," and the transaction between them had changed shape. But what she did, the fraud on the estate, the documents, 3 years of, it can't just sit there. It needs a consequence that isn't me. "The organization has a legal division," he said. "They operate entirely within the law. They're some of the best attorneys in the country." "I know. I want to use them." "They're yours to use." She looked at him. "I don't want to keep the estate money," she said. "Whatever comes back through the legal process. I've thought about this." "All right. There are shelters. For women who are in the situation I was in, controlled, isolated, no resources. I want the money to go there." She held his gaze. All of it. He looked at her. He thought about the woman who had walked into a crumbling chapel in an ivory dress that didn't fit, who had signed a marriage certificate in 11 minutes with the flat effect of someone who has run out of options, who had cooked eggs at the counter because the table felt like too much of a decision, who had wept alone in a storage room over her dead father's handwriting and then pulled herself back together before morning and come to the kitchen and sat across from him and asked him the question that had started everything. He thought about the bench in the garden, the annotated margins of the books she had begun reading from his shelves, the conference room and her reading of 12 Faces, and the specific intelligence of her afterward in the hallway, the second name. Your face did something. He thought about the warehouse floor. All of it, he said. She settled back against the pillow with the careful movement of a woman who has negotiated a peace with her pain. "Tell your grandfather I'll meet him when I'm out of here. He'll be glad to hear it. And Dong-su. I'll tell him you're awake. Tell him he counted right," she said. "The 14 minutes. He almost smiled. "I'll tell him." She closed her eyes. Not the closing of unconsciousness, the closing of a person who has been running on emergency fuel for 24 hours and is finally, in the specific safety of this room and this hand and this moment, allowing the emergency to stand down. Her breathing slowed. Her hands relaxed under his. He sat beside her bed and held her hand and watched her sleep. And outside the window, the sky was doing what it does regardless, turning from the pre-dawn gray into the particular pale gold of early morning, the color of a day that does not know or care about the night that preceded it. He sat there for a long time. Do-hyun came in after 2 hours and stood in the doorway and looked at his grandson sitting beside the bed of a sleeping woman with dried blood on his shirt and the specific quality of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not plan to arrive and has discovered in the arriving that the destination was the right one all along. The old man said nothing. He stood for a moment, then he pulled the door closed and left them to it. Celine Brooks was arrested on a Thursday morning 6 weeks later. The legal team from the Baiko organization, operating entirely within legitimate channels, leaving a paper trail that was clean and complete and would withstand any scrutiny, presented the documentation to the district attorney's office with the particular precision of people who had spent 3 weeks assembling a case from the materials that Celine's own records provided. 3 years of financial fraud, forged documents relating to the estate transfer, illegal guardianship proceedings conducted while Naya was still 17, tax filings that did not reflect the full scope of the assets taken. Nia was not present for the arrest. She had not wanted to be. She had understood in the weeks of her recovery that some conclusions did not require her witness. The conclusion had been building since her father's death. It did not need her standing on a sidewalk watching it arrive to become real. She was in the garden when Taijin told her it was done. The walled space behind the east wing with the bench in the corner and the tree whose species she had looked up and found was a Korean hornbeam, a species that grows slowly, with wood so hard it is sometimes called ironwood, planted by someone who understood that the things worth keeping take time. She was sitting on the bench with her father's notebook open in her lap. Her side still pulled sometimes when she breathed too deeply. The surgeon had said 6 weeks, and 6 weeks was not quite finished, but the pulling was diminishing. becoming the kind of reminder that a body keeps not because it is still damaged, but because it intends to remember. She looked up when he came through the garden door. He crossed the garden and sat beside her on the bench and told her, "Arrested. Bail denied based on flight risk. Trial date set. Every stolen asset frozen pending legal review." She looked at the notebook in her lap, her father's handwriting on the open page, a grocery list of all things from some ordinary day years before. Milk, rice, the particular brand of hot sauce he had liked, a reminder to call someone named Jerome about something that was now permanently unknown. The ordinary debris of a life that had been lived fully in its own terms and then ended too soon and been stolen from, even in its ending. She closed the notebook. "The estate sold," she said. "Last week. The legal team moved quickly once the freeze was lifted on the legitimate assets. And the shelters. The funds were transferred yesterday. 3 separate organizations. The director of one of them asked me to convey," she used the word transformative, "for what the amount would do." Nia looked at the garden wall. The afternoon light was slanted and warm, and the garden smelled of the particular combination of soil and green that had become, over 6 weeks of recovery and slow walks and mornings on this bench, the smell of something she had not had since she was 17. Home. She did not say this out loud. She turned it over in herself instead, examined it, tested its edges, checked it for the specific instability of things that are real but fragile. It held. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. He was facing her on the bench with the direct quality he had when something mattered, and she saw in his face the unguarded thing, fully present now, no longer requiring the warehouse floor to extract it, available in ordinary light in a garden on an afternoon because somewhere in the accumulated days he had stopped requiring extraordinary circumstances to be fully seen. "The marriage," he said, "the way it started, the way none of it was chosen." He held her gaze. "I want to ask you if you'll stay in it, not because there's nowhere else to go, not because it's the practical option, because you want to." She looked at him. She thought about the chapel, the 11 minutes, the ivory dress that had never been hers, the certificate she had held while the ink was still drying with the flat effect of a person at the end of their options. She thought about the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, the storage room, the conference room, and the 12 faces. The card was 6 words. The bench in the garden, the warehouse floor. She thought about her father's notebook in her lap, and a man who had sent someone to rescue it from a garbage pile because it was hers. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, not relief yet, but the specific focused quality of a man who is listening with his whole attention. "No more decisions made above my head," she said, "about my safety, my position, my information. I'm not a variable to be managed." "Agreed. Your grandfather. I want a real relationship with him, not a formality. He wants the same thing. He told me specifically. The organization, the transition you started toward legitimate operations. I want a timeline, a real one, not a gesture." He held her gaze. 5 years, he said. "Complete transition. I've already begun the structural work. Do-hyun is helping." She absorbed this. Then, "And no more homeless men near train tracks." He looked at her. "If you need to know something about yourself," she said, "you can ask me." The silence that followed this was the particular quality of silence that forms when something true has been said with enough precision that there is no useful response but acknowledgement. "Okay," he said, quietly. She looked at the garden, at the hornbeam in the corner with its slow-grown ironwood, at the afternoon light on the old stone wall, at the world that was, despite everything it had put her through, despite 3 years of kitchen floors and stolen inheritances and 11-minute ceremonies and warehouse floors and bullets that had missed what they needed to miss, undeniably, stubbornly, still full of things that were worth staying for. "Then yes," she said, "I'll stay." He did not say anything for a moment. He reached over and she felt his hand cover hers, the same gesture, the one that had started in a car on the way to a warehouse and had become by now the specific language of everything they had not yet put into words. She turned her hand over and held his. 1 year later, the Kang Estate's eastern garden was strung with lights that someone had spent the better part of a day threading through the hornbeam branches and along the top of the old stone wall. It was evening. There were perhaps 40 people, not the hundreds that a man of Tai Jin's former profile might once have convened, Not the display of power, but the specific people who had earned the right to be in a room and know what the room meant. Dong-su stood near the garden wall with a drink he had barely touched, watching everything with the expression he always wore. The controlled assessment, the cataloging of a man who has never fully stepped out of operational mode but has learned over a year to let it run quietly in the background while the foreground contained something else. Do-hyun sat in the chair that had been placed for him near the hornbeam. He was old in a way that had progressed over the year, slower to rise, more deliberate in his movements. But his eyes had not aged. They were the same eyes that had watched a photograph of a 20-year-old woman in a storage room full of her dead father's notebooks and said, "This one." He watched his grandson cross the garden, and he watched the woman. His grandson crossed the garden toward, and his face held something that was, in its way, the most honest expression he had worn in 40 years of a life spent in the discipline of concealment. It was something like peace. The peace of a man who has made enough costly mistakes to understand exactly what their corrective looks like when it arrives. Nia was in a dress that was hers. That distinction, "This is mine, I chose this, nobody handed it to me," had not diminished in a year. She suspected it would not diminish. She suspected that the women who have had things taken from them carry the ownership of chosen things with a specific and permanent weight, and she had decided that this was not a wound but a form of knowledge. Taejin reached her and stopped and looked at her the way he had been looking at her all day. The same way he had looked at her in the hospital room, in the garden, across the kitchen table, across the 6 weeks of recovery and the 6 months of transition work and the particular ordinary extraordinary texture of a year that had not been easy and had not tried to be anything other than what it was. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the 40 people, the lights in the hornbeam, the old man in his chair, Dong-su at the wall, the evening sky doing its thing above the garden with the complete indifference to occasion that she had always found, for some reason, deeply reassuring. "I've been ready," she said. The second ceremony was brief and private and said exactly what it meant and nothing more. No performance. No ivory dress that belonged to someone else. No lectern man with a folder looking at his watch. Just 2 people in a garden at evening with the lights in the hornbeam and 40 witnesses who understood what they were witnessing. Taejin Kang, who had walked away from an empire to find out if he was still human, had found his answer. Not on train tracks. Not in the empty metrics of a homeless man's anonymity. In a kitchen at 2:30 in the morning. In a conference room. In a car on the way to a warehouse. On a concrete floor with his hands pressed against a wound that had not taken the thing it aimed at. Nia Okafor, who had been sold for $200 by a woman who had calculated that she had no value beyond the transaction, had not spent the year becoming someone new. She had spent it becoming more completely herself, the woman her father's eyes had belonged to, the woman who could read a room of 12 strangers and identify the cold face, who could sit in the architecture of a threat and dismantle its mechanism. Who could step in front of something terrible and do it without calculation, because some decisions are not decisions but revelations of what was already true. She had not escaped one cage for another. She had done something that required more precision than escape. She had chosen. The difference between those two things, escape and choice, is the entire distance between a life that happens to you and a life that belongs to you. She knew the distance. She had walked every inch of it. And when the lights in the hornbeam came on fully as the sky darkened, and the 40 people in the garden held their glasses up, and the old man in his chair pressed his lips together against something he would never put into words, and Dong-su at the wall permitted himself the briefest smile before returning to his customary assessment of the perimeter, Nia Okafor stood in her own garden in her own dress beside the man she had chosen, and she breathed in the evening air and the smell of ironwood and old stone. And she thought about her father, not with grief, but with the particular quiet gratitude of a daughter who has finally, after everything, made good on what he saw in her. The lights held, the evening held, the garden held. And that was enough. That was, in the end, entirely enough.